Sometimes it would seem that boys' heads are hung on swivels. They turn so easily. Dresses hanging unused in a girl's clothes closet are not paying their rent. It is no compliment to you to wear clothes that make a man or boy turn the head to look and gape and stare. You got that right. I love finding old books, especially old home economics books, because they're like little time capsules. They tell you so much about what everyday people valued, worried about, and thought was important. This one is the Home Economics Omnibus. It was published in 1936, but not for students. It was for teachers teaching home economics to senior high school girls in the United States. It's over 600 pages long with 7 sections concerning everything from health and nutrition to house planning, house management and furnishings, child care and development, and family and social relationships. But one chapter immediately caught my attention: The Well-Dressed Girl. An entire lesson devoted to teaching young women how to dress, behave, and present themselves to the world. And honestly, I thought this chapter was going to be completely ridiculous. Instead, it's a little more complicated than that. Some of it made me laugh. Some of it definitely made me cringe. And then every once in a while, I'd read something and think, hold on, that's actually really good advice. So today I thought we would read through part of it together. Not to laugh at the past, although we probably will a little, but to see what ideas deserve to stay in 1936 and which ones still have something to teach us. So let's see what 1936 has to say about the well-dressed girl. Let's consider the ABCDE of the well-dressed girl. A girl is well-dressed when she is attractively dressed. The best way to illustrate this is to point out the difference between looking like a vision and looking like a sight. Both attract attention. When your brother tells you that your new hat makes you look a sight, he is not being complimentary. But when he whistles and says, "Gee, sis, you're a vision in that new dress," you preen yourself as if you really had the feathered wings of an angel. A well-bred person never turns and stares at anyone. But when you pass another girl on the street and almost forget your manners because you want to turn once more to see the neat way that dress sets off her coloring, when you wish you knew her well enough to ask her where she bought that coat, when you feel that way, you have seen an attractively dressed girl. It is no compliment to you to wear clothes that make a man or boy turn the head to look and gape and stare. You got that right. Sometimes it would seem that boys' heads are hung on swivels. They turn so easily. But when you, a well-bred girl, want to turn your head and look admiringly at another girl, then you may be sure that she is attractively dressed. The girl is a vision. Boys' heads turn just as readily to look at sights as they do at visions. In fact, a little more readily. Measure the attractiveness of your outfit by the looks of the girls, not the boys. Now, this surprised me. I kind of expected this to center men as the ultimate goal, but that's not what they're saying. I don't particularly care for the term well-bred, but I really like the idea that male attention isn't the goal. I've actually found that when another woman compliments something I'm wearing, it somehow means more. I would probably change one thing though. I don't think that we should dress for women's approval either. I think we should dress for ourselves and because we enjoy it. But I do think that they are pointing us in a healthier direction than I expected. I'm curious, what compliment means more to you? One from a stranger, a friend, or another vintage enthusiast? A girl is well dressed when she is becomingly dressed. There are 2 aspects of this word. First, your clothes may actually become part of you. Once you have them on, you forget about them. Such clothes do not call for continuing pulling up of shoulder straps, poking down of ribbons, peeping coyingly up from the neckline, pulling down of skirts over knees, or pulling down of foundation garments every time you stand. Clothes may be becoming because they make you appear at your best. You know, I actually think this is really good advice, and I've said something similar in a lot of my videos over the years. When I first started dressing in vintage styles, I thought there was this trade-off. If I wanted to look elegant, I kind of just had to accept being a little uncomfortable. I'd buy a dress because it looked beautiful on the hanger or because it looked lovely standing perfectly still in front of a mirror. But then I would wear it out into the real world and I'd spend the entire evening adjusting the neckline or tugging at the waist, smoothing the skirt every time I stood up. And eventually I realized that if I'm constantly thinking about my clothes, I'm not thinking about the conversation I'm having. I'm not enjoying the museum I'm visiting. I'm not present with the people I'm with. The best outfits are the ones that you almost forget you're wearing. They fit well, they move with you, and they just let you get on with your day. So I actually think they got this one exactly right. Maybe not because they were trying to promote confidence in the way that we would think about it today, but that is the result. When your clothes work for you instead of demanding your attention, you just naturally feel more confident. Now, this is where they start to lose me a little. The author goes on to talk about choosing clothes based on the shape of your head, the slimness of your neck, the size of your waist and hips, and your height and weight, if you want to be good looking. And I understand what they're trying to say. There's something to be said for understanding proportions and finding silhouettes that make you feel your best. But this is also where you start to see the downside of a lot of vintage fashion advice, because it didn't stop at helping women find clothes they liked. It often became a list of rules about what women should hide, disguise, minimize, or correct. If you've ever looked through vintage magazines, you've probably seen those diagrams or illustrations of the do's and don'ts for the plump girl or the petite girl or the broad-shouldered girl, with all the little arrows pointing to what was supposedly wrong. Apparently, every woman had something wrong that needed fixing. Thankfully, I think we've moved somewhat away from that way of thinking. But I do think that there is an important distinction in this thought process. I don't dress to hide my body. I dress to celebrate it. Over the years, I've learned what silhouettes that I love on my body, not because someone told me that I need to disguise my hips or create an illusion of a waist, but because those are the clothes that make me feel most like myself. A girl is well dressed when she is correctly dressed. That means no satin slippers at a baseball game. Okay, I'll give you that one. No cotton midi at an evening dance. It means swishy clothes for evenings and perky clothes for sports. It means that a girl who wears secondhand finery to school deserves to fail in at least the subject, what a well-dressed girl wears. Well, sorry to say, the whole vintage community has now failed this course. But seriously, now, I actually agree with some of this, although maybe not for the reasons the author intended. I do think that there's something to be said for dressing appropriately for what you're doing. I probably wouldn't wear satin slippers to a baseball game, although if you do, I'd love to see it. I think modern society has swung a little in the opposite direction, where just almost anything goes all the time. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. We have so much more freedom to express ourselves than women did in 1936. And I certainly wouldn't want to lose that. But I also think that we've lost a little bit of the idea that our clothes can support what we're doing. When I'm spending the day walking around Vienna running errands, I dress differently than I would for a nice dinner. Not because there's some rule book telling me I have to, but because different activities call for different clothes. Now, of course, where the section starts to go off the rails for me is when it says that a girl wearing secondhand finery to school deserves to fail at being a well-dressed girl. But of course, we are seeing this through a modern lens, and it's where you can see how ideas about being dressed correctly becomes tied up with class and social status, and with telling people where they did and didn't belong. And it's worth remembering that secondhand had a different meaning in 1936 than it does today. Today, many of us proudly wear secondhand clothing because we love vintage, we care about sustainability, or we just simply enjoy finding something unique. Back then, secondhand clothing was much more likely to be associated with financial necessity than personal style. What makes me giggle a little bit is that if the author could see today's vintage community, she would probably be horrified. We happily spend hours searching antique stores, flea markets, and estate sales looking for beautifully made secondhand clothes. But again, those secondhand garments for us were brand new for them. So this is one of those moments where the practical advice about dressing for the occasion gets a little tangled up with the social attitudes of the time. I can absolutely appreciate the idea of wearing clothes that suit the activity, but I have zero interest in the idea that someone's worth or their grade in a home economics class should be tied to whether their clothes were bought new. But if I strip away all of that judgment, I actually think there is a useful idea underneath. Dress in a way that supports the life you're actually living. Let your clothes work for you, not against you. A girl is well dressed when she is distinctively dressed. Here is where you are most apt to fail, for you haven't had a chance to learn that distinction comes from within and seldom from without. You think that the girl with fair hair and dark lashes, the girl with coal black hair and clear complexion, the girl with long curling golden lashes has every advantage over you with your mouse-colored hair or your mediocre features. But you are wrong, really. If you have a generous mouth and a sunshiny smile, capitalize that. Be a sunny person in clothes as well as disposition. The girl with the sunlit hair may have a discontented mouth, and discontent does not get you far. Actresses know enough to make an asset of a crooked smile, of a generous mouth, of downright homeliness. It is true that some women are so homely they are attractive. Such a woman knows enough to stay away from the picture prettiness in the clothes she wears. The contrast between herself and the clothes would be too great. Distinctive clothes help to highlight, to accent you. Make your clothes do things for you. Make them bring out the distinctive you that sets you apart from Susie Jones down the street. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this. At this point, I was expecting another list of rules. Instead, this chapter suddenly became kind of encouraging. I really like the central idea here, which is stop worrying about what you don't have and start making the most of what you do have. The examples are definitely a product of the 1930s. They spend quite a bit of time talking about your hair color, your eye color, your complexion, and choosing clothes that make those features stand out. But if I strip away the very dated language, I actually think there's a lovely message underneath. Not everyone has the same features, and that's okay. In fact, that's the whole point. Find the things that make you uniquely you and celebrate those. I actually think this advice is even more relevant today than it was in 1936. We live in a time where beauty trends move incredibly fast. One year, everyone wants one eyebrow shape. The next year, another. One haircut becomes fashionable. One style of makeup becomes fashionable, and before long, it can start to feel like everybody has the same face, the same hair, the same look. One of the things that I love about vintage style, and really any alternative style, is that it encourages individuality rather than uniformity. I know this chapter was written for teenage girls in the 1930s, but I actually think this advice would work for anyone who's chosen to dress a little differently from the people around them. Whether you wear 1940s fashion, Edwardian clothing, goth, or something completely your own, The goal isn't to look like everyone else. It's to look more like yourself. A girl is well dressed when she is economically dressed. That means more than it says on the surface. Economical clothes are those that, costing much or little at the outset, cost little in upkeep after you begin to wear them. Sometimes cheap dresses are so cheap the fabric is sleazy. The seams pull out, the trimming frays, the material shrinks when laundered. No matter how cheap that frock was in the beginning, it is not and never can be an economical dress. Economical clothes are those that fit into your scheme of living. An elaborate evening dress for a girl who seldom goes to parties is not cheap, even at the low initial purchase price. A house dress for a business girl who is at the office all day and slips a smock or apron over her office dress when she gets home is not economical, even though it costs but 50 cents. Dresses hanging unused in a girl's clothes closet are not paying their rent, let alone paying for their initial cost. This idea is really at the heart of why so many of us love vintage clothing. One thing that's changed dramatically since this book was written is our relationship to clothing. Clothes have become much less expensive to buy, but they're often made with the expectation that they aren't going to last forever. We've become very accustomed to buying clothing that serves us for a season or two before moving on to the next thing. This book comes from a time when people expected their clothes to last and expected themselves to take care of them. Sometimes spending a little more time on something that you'll wear for years ends up being the more economical choice. It's one of the things that I find so fascinating about vintage clothing. So many of the garments we treasure today have already survived 80, 90, 100 years. That's not always because they were beautifully made, although many of them were. It's also because people repaired them, stored them carefully, and expected them to have a long life. Of course, not everything made in the 1930s was beautifully constructed, and not everything made today is poor quality. But I do think that we've lost a little of that mindset that clothing is something that you invest in and care for. The other idea I really love is choosing clothes that fit your life, not the life that you wish you had, not the life someone on Instagram has, your actual life. If you work from home, your wardrobe should probably reflect that. If you're constantly walking around a city like I am, your clothes and your shoes should support that. If you spend your weekends gardening, hiking, going to museums, or chasing after children, that's the life your wardrobe should be designed for. When I first opened this book, I expected it to be full of silly rules. And it certainly has plenty of those, but what surprised me most wasn't outdated advice. It was discovering how modern ideas were hiding underneath it. Buying less, but buying better. Finding clothes that really suit you instead of chasing every trend. Letting your clothes support your confidence instead of becoming the center of attention. Those ideas don't only belong to 1936. They're timeless. And maybe that's why I love books like this so much. They remind us that history is rarely as simple as we think it is. Sometimes it's wonderfully wrong. Sometimes it's surprisingly wise. And sometimes it's both on the very same page. I think we'll definitely have to come back to this one and see what other nuggets of advice it has for us. I'll see you next time.